Okay, well, why don't we begin? For those of you I don't know, I'm Eric Cohen, the CEO of Tikvah, and it's tremendously exciting as we honor Yom Ha'Atzmaut, the Israel Day of Independence, a day of tremendous celebration in the Jewish calendar and the Zionist calendar, as we think today about the meaning and the miracle that is modern Israel. And we'll have a day of different sessions of learning, but we have the real privilege of beginning with my good friend, Dan Senor, who probably needs no introduction. He's the author of a number of important books, articles, essays on the meaning of Israel, of course, Startup Nation, a term that really fired the imagination of the entrepreneurial energy that is the Jewish state, and his more recent book on the genius of Israel. And his task today is something that has very good Zionist tradition, which is to imagine the Jewish future, to imagine the Israeli future. It was Herzl himself in the late 1800s who imagined, as the founder of political Zionism, what a Jewish state could look like. And what I asked Dan to do for us this morning is to imagine what modern Israel could look like at 100. Israel 2048. What will the nation be? What can it become? And I think Dan is going to give us a very hopeful future of Jewish imagination, Jewish creativity, Jewish resilience in the face of obvious challenges, but fueled by that deep and abiding Zionist purpose. So Dan, we're honored to have you to kick off this day of learning. I'm going to turn it over to you to give about a 20-minute talk, and then we'll have some time for conversation and questions. Dan, thanks for being here, and thanks for beginning this day in such a hopeful and imaginative way.
Great. Thank you, Eric, and thank you everyone who's joined. I'll just start before I get into the substance of my talk that I'm always really honored and privileged and grateful for opportunities to participate in events with Tikvah, learning sessions with Tikvah. I've done a lot of my own learning and my own sort of evolution of my thinking on a range of things through Tikvah. So it's a real, like I said, I really enjoy being able to teach back, if you will. I I, I will say the following. I am hopeful, as Eric said, about Israel at 100, Israel going forward decades. But the reason I'm hopeful, and I had been hopeful for some time, and this is going to sound odd what I'm about to say, but I think even though I had been hopeful, I had some major concerns about Israel's future. And ironically, the 18 months or so since October 7th, 2023, have made me even more hopeful and increasingly convinced me that the concerns I had were going to be addressed, not because Israel came up with a plan to address them, but the last 18 months have forced Israel to address or begin to realize it had to address several things that had been holding them back, and I think revealed to Israel some enormous opportunities it had and it is now seizing. So there's a lot I can get into here. I'm just going to address about three or four areas, and then we can get into our conversation. The first is obviously Israel's security and geopolitical position. And the question I often ask myself is on October 6th, 2023, the day before the massacre began on Israel, had Yahya Sinwar been told, look, you're going to launch this attack on October 7th. And within 18 months, let me paint a picture for you of what the Middle East will look like. One, Hamas will be largely wiped out. That is to say, is Hamas still fighting? Of course it is. But Hamas now is basically barely hanging on. You can look at these offers they're making in the most recent round of hostage negotiations, and you can still see a sense of desperation and the quality of the fighters they are recruiting. They had, over the previous 15 years prior to October 7th, 2023, from what we know from the Israeli security establishment, had recruited and trained and cultivated a pretty sophisticated, relative to what had normally come out of the Palestinian intifadas, fighting force. That is not what they have today. They are recruiting kids. They're not very well trained. They're not very well armed. And this is to say, I don't want to get into a whole analysis of the state of Hamas's fighting capabilities, but Hamas, for all intents and purposes, as a strategic threat to Israel, has been wiped out. Its leadership has been largely wiped out. Hamas's sister organization, if you will, up in the north, in Hezbollah on Israel's northern border, which had actually been the real threat that the Israeli security establishment had been focused on for some time, and was the reason that Israel was effectively deterred from doing a lot of the things Israel wanted to do in the region over the previous decade or so, basically back to the Second Lebanon War. And when you would talk to decision makers, planners, strategic planners, political leaders in Israel, they would every question you would pose about why don't you deal with this? Obviously, this was a lot dealing with Iran. Why don't you deal with that? What was ultimately holding Israel back was the fear that Hezbollah, which was the equivalent of like a light infantry army of a sovereign nation, that was actually, unlike Hamas, was actually very much battle hardened because they had spent years in Syria actually fighting to prop up the Assad regime, to protect the Assad regime. And they had this arsenal of, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, depending on whose estimate you believe, of very sophisticated rockets and missiles, some of which could hit right into central Tel Aviv, could hit critical infrastructure throughout Israel. So if you told Sinwar, Hamas will be wiped out, and oh, by the way, Hezbollah will be wiped out, and Hezbollah's leader, Hassan Nasrallah, like you, Sinwar, will be gone from this world. So now these two threats on Israel's southern and northern border are gone. And then you told Sinwar, oh, I know this is going to be hard to believe, but the Assad regime, which was the most important sovereign proxy government of Iran, also on Israel's border, the Assad regime that had been in power for 50 years, the Assad regime that had basically survived a civil war for about a decade and a half, would collapse. And Bashar Assad and his family would be living somewhere outside in the outskirts of Moscow. And the regime would just be completely gone. And then you told Sinwar and Iran, the primary sponsor of chaos in the region, and specifically the architect of, I would say, either at best, the shrinking of Israel's security, if not its ultimate goal, the complete wiping out of Israel, and which was the primary sponsor of this ring of fire that existed around Israel. That's what we now refer to as the seven front, Israel's seven fronts, battle fronts. The sponsor that had been driving all of that pressure on Israel. Iran, for the first time, would get in a situation twice now where it gets into a country on country military back and forth with Israel over the course of the last 18 months. So it wasn't just Iran and Israel fighting one another through proxies, but they were going to actually launch projectiles at one another. Israeli aircraft, a third of the Israeli Air Force would be flying over Iran in one military operation, in the most recent one. So this whole fear of what if Israel gets into an actual war with Iran? Well, it's kind of happened. And what we know today, and there's a lot we don't know, so let me caveat that, but what we know today is that most of Iran's air defenses have been wiped out. We know this not only from the Israelis, but from international sources. The U.S. Intelligence community has basically said a version of this. Is Rich Goldberg, who's a friend of mine, who's been on my podcast many times, who's at FTD. The way he phrased it is, what we now know is the Ayatollah has no clothes, meaning they're completely exposed. Israel managed to fly, as I said, a third of its air force in the last operation over Iran, conduct this operation overnight, and the entire Israeli Air Force was back home. Everyone who participated from the Air Force was back home and be able to have breakfast with their children Saturday morning, Shabbat, after the night of that operation. So Iran is now completely exposed. And I can go on and on and on, but this is just a long-winded way of saying that these threats that Israel had to deal with, it now knows it had to deal with Hamas. It didn't know that on October 6th, but it did know that the threats from Hezbollah, Syria, and Iran were going to be Israel's existence for the foreseeable future. And one way or the other, Israel would have to transform the region in this regard and transform its geopolitical position in the region. And I would say today, just analytically, if you just look at the picture I just painted, Israel's in the strongest geopolitical position it has been in its history. I think going back, I think the only comparison point is after the 6 Day War. that also transformed the region. Israel's now in a transformation of the region moment. So that relates to Israel's um, threats. Now let's talk about or enemies. Now let's talk about Israel's friends in the region, or I like to say friends and future friends. The Abraham Accords countries, one could have easily imagined. So in May of 2021, just a few months into the Biden administration, Israel and Hamas got into that short war. It was about 11 days. And that was the first war between Palestinians and Israelis since the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords were signed in 2020. And there were two major developments against the backdrop of the Abraham Accords in May of 21. One was obviously Hamas and Israel were fighting, and presumably a lot of Palestinians would get killed in that process. It was a short war, obviously relative to what we've seen recently. And two, for the first time, we saw major tensions in the Israeli Arab in the relations between Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews inside Israel. So certain towns and cities that have large Israeli Arab populations in Israel, historically, even when things got tense between Israel and the Palestinians, it wouldn't necessarily blow up in terms of the relations between Israeli Jews and Israeli Palestinians, Israeli Arabs. And for the first time, we saw real skirmishes breaking out, which was very worrisome. And what I was hearing from friends in the Gulf, in the Sunni Gulf, was this moment, May of 21. This is the ultimate test of the Abraham Accords. If the Abraham Accords, it's unlikely the Abraham Accords will survive this. This is how people were talking because it was going to put too much pressure on these Arab countries, and they would in some way turn into a cold peace, so something more akin to the Israeli Egypt peace treaty, or the legacy of the Israeli Arab peace treaty, or worse, or they'll just end, they'll break. They didn't. They survived. And then October 7th happened. And that's when I heard, okay, now this is the real test, because many in the Gulf were saying, we know Israel's going to have to respond. It's going to have to respond very aggressively. And that's going to blow up the Abraham Accords. So here we are on, what is it, April 27th. The Abraham Accords are as strong as they were when they were signed in 2020. They have endured. I can go through the data if folks are interested, but there's tremendous amount happening in terms of Emiratis and Bahrainis in particular in Israel, doing important work on innovation, co-innovation, and Israel itself Israelis are in these countries as well. There's a lot of talk about the AI revolution that is sweeping, the global economy. The AI revolution requires a lot of things, but one of them is it requires enormous capital. Unlike previous technology booms we have experienced, where a little bit of a capital could catalyze a company to have a transformative impact and reach enormous scale very quickly. Unlike those previous booms, the AI boom requires enormous capital, and those companies that are thriving in the AI area have anything touching AI have raised literally hundreds of billions of dollars. Israel has the technologists and the researchers and the scientists to be a major player in the AI boom. What it doesn't have is access to massive amounts of capital. It doesn't have a sovereign wealth fund. It doesn't have an oil industry, or it doesn't have a meaningful sovereign wealth fund. It doesn't have an energy sector like its neighbors in the region have that can fuel, no pun intended, its sovereign wealth fund. And suddenly you're hearing talk now about, the burgeoning relationship, not just because of the Abraham Accords, but because suddenly you have Israeli technologists and Emirati capital being able to partner to be major players in not only tech as we've known it in Israel, but this whole AI revolution. And so it's not just that the Abraham Accords have survived the last year and a half. I would say they've actually deepened in spite of what has happened over the last year and a half. But that, to me, while interesting, is less interesting to me than the opportunities that have opened up for Israelis on the economic front over the last year and a half. And there are a range of them, but I want to focus on just one to give you an example. The Israel was already a leader in the cyber security sector long before October 7th. It was, responsible for more M&A, more exits, more transactions in the cybersecurity area than any country in the world. It is sought after by every, if you think about the major players in the world in a geopolitical sense, whether it's the United States, India, various players throughout Asia, countries like Korea. You see Israel in the middle of these relationships, both bilateral, multilateral relationships, often on the role it plays on the cybersecurity front, both on the business side and the government side. Now, there's another sector that I think is going to be as vibrant as the cybersecurity sector in the decades ahead, and that's going to be the defense tech sector. Because not only has Israel's geopolitical position been transformed since October 7th, 2023, the whole nature of warfighting that both we and the Israelis and many around the world are imagining for the world ahead is being changed before our eyes. When you think about tunnel warfare, when you think about drones, when you think about the role of AI in warfighting and AI in the role of defense, many in the defense tech sector, the defense technology sector, view basically two places today as laboratories of the future of warfighting for every country around the world that engages in some kind of warfighting or will need to. Israel and Ukraine are the two laboratories. And they all say, the ones who are investing and building relationships with the defense tech sectors, they say, look, both Ukraine and Israel are the future. This is a laboratory. We're watching the future play out. But the difference is Israel has this community, this ecosystem of technologists that can actually build entire enterprises, build an entire part of its economy around the future of this warfighting. And so you have, and I'll just say anecdotally, you have stories, and the number, it bears out, it's not just anecdote, but I'll just tell one story to give an example. You have stories like a young Israeli technologist, late 20s, who is working for Google in Israel, and he gets called up to fight in Gaza, and he's in Gaza for any number of months, and he comes back from his Miluim, and he says, I could go back to my job at Google, working on the algorithm for, that improves the efficiency and performance of ads on Google, which is basically what I was working on before October 7th. Or I've just seen the future of warfighting. I have this technology skill. The way what Israel is dealing with is now going to become relevant to many countries around the world. I can go work on improve the defense of my own country and help Israel's friends and help deepen Israel's reach around the world by building a company in the defense tech space that leverages my technology talent with what I've learned over the last few months. And you're seeing story after story after story of people who were working at big multinational companies that were set up in Israel. There's, over 500 of these multinational companies who said, this has been a great run. This has been a great experience. I've learned a lot. But now there's this burgeoning defense tech sector that is going to put Israel on the map globally even more than it had already been on the map. And I want to go build in that area. There are about 160 of those defense tech startups today, much more than there were before October 7th. And I think it is only going to grow and grow and grow. So Israel's geopolitical position has never been better. Its economic position, while challenged for some reasons that are out of its control, but as far as um, what Israel can control, it is doing very well. In fact, as you saw, I'm sure in recent weeks, there was this company called Wiz that was sold to Google. Google, largest acquisition Google has made in its history, and this is the largest in its history of acquiring companies anywhere in the world. And it was the largest acquisition of an Israeli company, largest exit of an Israeli company, about $32 billion. Happened while Israel was bogged down in this war. So one can only imagine when Israel's not bogged down in a war, what opportunities there will be for Israel. So I think its economic situation is quite exciting. And now, before I wrap, let me just get into one area that I think Israel would have had to deal with at some point, but this last 18 months is accelerating the speed with which it will have to deal with it. And I think that's healthy. I wrote in my last book, The Genius of Israel, about the uh, Saul Singer and I wrote about the health of Israeli society. And we go through a bunch of metrics that basically, in which we argued that uh, Israel has tensions in its society, it has divisions in its society. We're even seeing it play out right now. And Israel's not alone in that regard. Basically, every Western or Western style democracy over the last decade plus, has experienced intense polarization, um, intense division, and Israel is not immune to that. What Israel does have, we argued in the book, are these, social shock absorbers. It has these guardrails that prevent Israel from actually truly going off the rails. And uh, again, we can get into it in the conversation, but we basically argue that just whenever you think Israel's just about to kind of go off the rails, it holds together. And there's certain societal infrastructure that keeps the country together. And by the way, this is not the first moment. The judicial reform of 2023 wasn't the first time we've seen that. The disagreements within Israel we're seeing play out right now about what to do about a potential hostage deal and ceasefire, and you just see hundreds of thousands of people storming the streets, and the rhetoric gets incredibly hot, incredibly hot. I get asked all the time, don't you think the rhetoric is getting too hot? Doesn't it make you nervous? Doesn't it make you uncomfortable? And the answer is yes, of course, but this is nothing new. It just gets less attention than, say, the 1950s, when there was a heated debate inside Israel about whether or not Israel should accept reparations from Germany for the Shoah or following the Shoah. And Menachem Begin, who was the leader of Herut, what was the Likud party, leader of the opposition, tried to organize protests to disrupt voting in the Knesset. There were protests and in downtown Jerusalem. The Knesset was in a different location at the time, where you'd have 10, 15,000 people show up, proportionate to Israel's population at the time. Those are numbers comparable to, if not bigger than, the protests we're watching today. Begin called on the protesters to storm the Knesset, physically march over the Knesset and storm the Knesset to disrupt the vote on whether or not Israel should accept reparations. I can fast forward to the division in Israel during the First Lebanon War, in which soldiers would fight in the war. Keep in mind, in Israel, as you know, when you fight in a war, you don't travel halfway across the world. You get on a bus and drive for an hour and a half. Israelis were fighting in a war. They'd come back on Shabbat. They come back on weekends, and they would join protests against the government. And then there were protests for the government, and these were massive, massive, massive protests. In one protest, pro-government protesters or activists killed, not intentionally, but it got violent, killed an anti-government activist. This was playing out. Now, there was no TikTok then. There was no cable news then. So we weren't all glued to the size of the protests and who's turning out to the protests and how hot the rhetoric has gotten. But this was happening. The country was being torn apart. Go to the Israel disengagement from Gaza, 2004, 2005. Massive, massive protests of Israelis, not just from Gaza, but Israelis who live throughout Israel who were opposed to Israel's disengagement from Gaza. So I give example after example after example. I think what has been unique about the last couple of years is both the judicial reform and then some of the protests we're seeing right now is that we're all watching minute to minute, and we think this is absolutely the worst it's ever been. There's no turning back. Israel's tearing itself apart. And my response to this is yes, but this has actually happened before, and Israel has managed to hold together. And I think we're watching, or we will watch over the last several decades, Israel holding itself together. Lastly, I'll wrap with this one area that I think must be addressed. I had always felt like, I think many Israelis, that it had to be addressed at some point, but there was no sense of urgency, is what to do in a society. And I talked about the health of Israeli society, and I continue to believe it's the healthy society by any metric, um, or at least comparing it to Western countries around the world. One of the reasons Israeli society is so healthy is because of the role of national service in Israel. The fact that the overwhelming majority of Israelis give 2, 3, 4 years at a minimum to national service, to the defense of their country. And these are Israelis on the right. These are Israelis on the left. These are religious Israelis. These are secular Israelis. These are, all walks of Israeli life make this. And as we've seen over the last year and a half, many of them will wind up or have or will wind up serving much longer than just their initial mandatory service. The one segment of the population that is all but excused from this, relieved of this, is the Haredi uh, community. And it was manageable before. It made a lot of Israelis uncomfortable, but it was manageable for the longest time. And the reason it was manageable is because Israel did not have to fight a long war. And if you look at Israeli history going back to the founding, most of the wars, all the wars really, that Israel had to fight were basically short, certainly short relative to the last year and a half. And they were mostly wars, what I would call kind of away games, wars that they were fighting, at least for the most decisive parts of the war in other parts of the Middle East. And Israel is now fighting primarily wars that are home games, that are wars on their own borders, and they are long. This is a long war, and it's not ending soon. And I think it is harder and harder for huge swaths of Israeli society to make their peace with the fact that there's a whole segment of the population that does not have to participate in that um, in that service and in that sacrifice in many cases. And there are many on the right who are increasingly of that view. Even many of the political bases of some of the parties in this current government who feel that way. Certainly, that is the case with a large number of Likud voters. That is the case with a large number of the national religious community. The national religious community has made an outsized contribution in terms of not only military service but in the sacrifices. There are whole yeshivas from the national religious community where you have just astonishing numbers of casualties of students from those yeshivot, 20, 30 students in some cases, who have been in an individual yeshiva that have been killed fighting since October 7th. And I think that this is creating fault lines within what we have thought of as a right of center coalition that would endure in Israel, which is some semblance of, and I'm oversimplifying it here, but some semblance of the Likud party, the national religious parties, and the Haredim. I don't think that coalition can hold together in the future. And I'm not here to provide political analysis whether or not it's a good thing or a bad thing, but I think the reason the fault line is emerging is because there's pressure now on the Haredim to change the way they have operated, not in other aspects. I think they've made very positive contributions to Israeli society, but just in terms of this question of service to the military. And I have had been concerned, like I said, it was a tolerable problem, but it was not sustainable indefinitely. And I think the last 18 months have accelerated the Israeli sense of urgency to deal with this issue. And I actually think it's going to get addressed quite soon. So you can imagine a world in which Israel's geopolitical position has never been better, as I said, since the Six-Day War. Its economic miracle, as Saul and I called it in our first book, is as true today as it was when we wrote the book, and in fact is actually growing and expanding in new areas that we wouldn't have known about but for the last year and a half. Israel's new relationships in the region are as strong as they were when they were negotiated in 2020. And in fact, there were new relationships on the horizon that even talk about Saudi normalization, which I'm cautiously optimistic about. And when there is Saudi normalization, it really is the end of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And the Israeli society, for all the noise and hysteria we're watching right now, is actually as strong and healthy as it has ever been, only that there's added pressure to deal with what I think is one of the major areas of tension that could have been enduring in Israeli society. I think that over the next decade, couple of decades, is going to be addressed in a meaningful way. So this is a long-winded way of Eric, of saying that I am quite optimistic about Israel's future, and I I don't want to say we have Yahya Sinwar and the mullahs in Iran to thank, but I do think this last year and a half was like a was like a stress test, an acid test about the endurance of the Israeli miracle, and I think it's thriving in a way that one could not have possibly imagined. I can't think of another country in the world that could have been through what Israel has been through over the last 18 months and come out in the way I'm describing. And it leaves me with a great sense of promise and hope about, Israel at 100.
Dan, thank you. You can hear me okay?
Yep.
So, one of the great markers of Israeli exceptionalism, and you've talked a lot about this, is that Israel still believes in the family, still having children. Meaning, what deeper affirmation that Israel has a bright future than in the life and blood of young Israelis that are being raised into the world with a sense of Zionist connection and purpose. So, as you think about Israel 2048, what do you think the population will look like? Not just the size, though the growth seems to be incredibly promising, but also the makeup of the culture and the country.
So, so first of all, I think the size is important because I think it'll continue to grow in a meaningful way. And it's not just that Israel's population is going to grow. I think the difference in the rate of growth of Israel's population relative to other countries is going to become more stark. When Saul and I started researching for our book for the Genius of Israel, we saw bits and pieces of press coverage about the coming demographic crisis around the world, in the East, in the West, everywhere you went, you saw it. And we were like, wow, this is really interesting. All these populations are bracing for um, shrinking population, shrinking demographics, and Israel's the outlier. And we would tell people this; they were sort of like, "Huh, that's interesting." Now, a week can't go by where you don't see some article, about In the U.S., by the way, the Trump administration in recent weeks has been having meetings about policies they could push to help with the potential demographic crisis facing the United States. So this is everywhere. So I just think that the contrast is not unimportant. I think the two look obviously critics of our argument about Israel's growing impressive fertility rates tend to say, well, it's just the Haredim or it's just the very religious. And again, the data does not bear out that criticism. It is true the Haredim and the religious and the national religious are having lots of babies, but so are secular Israelis. And you have secular Israelis, what we call secular Israelis. They're not really secular. I mean, we think of them as secular Israelis, but they are, as I often say, these take like I'll give you an example, like Lior Raz, right? He's the star of Fauda, the co-creator of Fauda. He's working. He just started shooting Fauda season 5. Which no spoilers here, but I know a little bit about the story, and it's going to be quite good for season 5. But he's a very successful Hollywood-like actor. He's a star in Israeli television film. He's now increasingly in U.S. productions. He has four. He's a little younger than me. He's 4 children. So this is a guy who's got like basically the equivalent of the Hollywood life or the Hollywood profession. Has 4 children. Celebrates Shabbat every Friday night. He serves or has served in the Israeli army, the army of the Jewish national, the Jewish state. He lives his life on a Hebrew calendar. When he's abroad doing shoots for films, he has it often negotiated through his agents that there are certain holidays that are just untouchable to him. That even most Jews in the West who aren't religiously observant wouldn't pay attention to. What, you need time off for Sukkot? What, you need time off for Pesach? What you need? I mean, he just lives his life on the Jewish calendar. That is, I'm just using him as an example of even what we call secular. They're not really secular, right? Their language is the Jewish language, the biblical language of Hebrew. They serve it in an Israeli army. They live on a Hebrew calendar. They do some kind of regular observance of Shabbat. So they are, and they have lots of children. So I think you are going to see the secular population of Israel, we call secular, even though as I'm saying it's not really secular, continuing to grow and play, not be squeezed out, if you will, quote unquote, by the Haredi population, which is what the demographers are often are the forecasting that, oh my gosh, it's going to be a Haredi country. I don't buy that. And lastly, I would say, Eric, is I think you're going to see more and more intermarriage. It's already happening. When I say intermarriage, I don't mean between Jews and non-Jews. I mean between Sephardim and Ashkenazis, Jews, between Mizrahi and Ashkenazi Jews. You're going to see more and more this idea that we have a tendency to talk about Israel. Those of us who've been following Israel and Israeli politics and Israeli history, we talk about these trends in Israel as though representative of, these different communities, from the Sephardic community, the Ashkenazi community, and this had this implication. This one voted for Begin, and this one was running the military, and this one. I think that that whole notion is going to seem like from another era. That you're basically seeing that there's going to be a much more um, blended society that I think will be in a very, I mean, I just look at many people I know. I look at family members of mine. I look at my, nieces and, the people they're in relationships with are not from these like, oh, it's a segmented Ashkenazi community. So I think the diversity of Israel is going, and the integration of these different communities is only going to increase.
So one more question for me, and then I want to invite a few of our students to come on and ask questions. We've got a bunch of Tikva students tuning in today. What do you think Israel's relationship with America will look like in 2048? How will it be fundamentally different, or will it be fundamentally different?
Israel's relationship with, sorry, I lost you for
With,
one second.
with America.
Yeah. You know, I think there are two things going on that are important. One is there's no question that the United States is um, withdrawing from the world. And this is not just a phenomenon of the last 100 days. This is not just a Trump phenomenon. I just think there has been a, uh, even though the Democrats would not want to articulate this way, there's a growing consensus between both parties on shrinking America's role in the world. And you saw this certainly as it relates to the Middle East, incredible pullback from the Middle East, both in beginning with, I think, the Obama administration and then the Trump administration, and then certainly the Biden administration. And you could argue this Trump administration too. So it transcends partisanship. Both parties have been pulling back. And I think a world in which America's pulling back generally and specifically from the Middle East, America's alliances will matter more in the Middle East. And it's not just any alliances, but it's what I would call capable allies. And capable allies are allies where the United States, where decision makers and planners at the senior levels of the American national security establishment can credibly argue that we are getting more out of this relationship than we're giving. And I think that is what the U.S. Leadership from both parties will increasingly view Israel as. We are getting more out of this than we are giving. And by the way, Israel's not the only country in the world that falls into that category. I think India is going to soon fall into that category. I've heard some in the Pentagon argue that Korea and Asia will fall into that category, where there's allies and then there are capable allies, and capable allies are allies that provide capabilities to the United States that we couldn't otherwise get, and it's a net positive for us, the United States. And for all the reasons I said, Eric, which is Israel's reach within the region that it now has, and it's now discovered that it can do over the last 18 months, and then these technology capabilities it's developing, not obviously in the defense space, as I said, defense tech sector, but also in the, but also, like I talked about AI and these other sectors that are going to have such a dominant role in the economy. You have so many American innovation leaders who are only deepening their ties with the Israeli tech ecosystem. I'll tell you, there was pressure. So, to tell you a very short story. After October 7th, about a year ago from now, I was at a conference with, I won't mention the name, but let's just say I was at a conference hosted, an off-the-record conference hosted by one of the biggest venture capitalists in Silicon Valley, not Jewish, and their firm had never done anything in Israel because they were of the view that you could only do venture investing in companies that are like within a couple hour drive from where the headquarters of your venture fund is. So you can't. The Middle East was too complicated. So two things he told me have changed since October 7th. One, he now has to be in Israel because this is a venture investor that does a lot of investing in cybersecurity, defense tech, cloud security, and you have to be in Israel. Like you can't not be in Israel. So A, he's investing in some of these major companies. B, he says in his entire career in Silicon Valley, he's never seen an issue divide friendships and business partnerships like the war in Gaza. It kind of blew his mind. He's like, we survived Me Too. We survived the post George Floyd craziness. We survived the Trump Muslim ban of 2017. We survived. I mean, I can go on and on and on. We survived all this. He says, and suddenly this issue and all the political baggage associated with it and all the anti-Semitism that it has revealed has broken apart decades-long partnerships, business partnerships. It has created so much tension in Silicon Valley. When he told me this story, I thought, my gosh, if what he's describing, which I'd seen versions of, is playing out in all these American tech companies at a time when there's pressure to isolate Israel economically and diplomatically, this is like a disaster. So here we are today. There are about 500 multinationals with major operations in Israel. When I say major operations, I'm talking about employing, thousands of Israelis. Some of these, you go to I encourage folks here, if you go to something, Google Startup Nation Finder, which is a resource that tracks all the activity going on in the Israeli tech scene, and startups. And you can see where how many multinational companies are in Israel. I said something like 500. How many Israelis are working at them? I thought if there was ever a moment where that would shrink, it was now, and it has not shrunk. And no multinational has announced they're pulling out of Israel. And so I think the combination of America's needs from a defense and intelligence standpoint for capable allies in the region, combined with the American innovation economy's need for co-innovators, I think the U.S.-Israel relationship will be very strong. Does that mean that I think the U.S. will pull back to some degree in terms of the funding it provides in terms of foreign assistance to Israel? Probably, but I don't think that's only because the American consensus will be, more kind of undergirded by this idea that it has to shrink its giving. I think it's going to be also because Israelis and the Israeli leadership is going to want this perception that Israel is reliant on American foreign assistance. I mean, you think about it, Israel's economy is about $400 to $500 billion, depending on how you measure it. Israel's the percentage of that is accounts the percentage of that is made up for by American assistance is a minuscule percentage. It's a tiny percentage. Given the rate at which the Israeli economy is growing, there's no reason why Israel over time, I mean, not just over time, pretty quickly, couldn't say to the American government, you know what, we're all good. We want to keep our relationship deep on the security front and all these different areas, but we don't need American taxpayer funds anymore. I can imagine a world in which Israel decides that it is better for its own position in the world to arrive at that. Now, there are some risks to that. I don't mean to go down a rabbit hole. When I talk to Israeli leaders about, should you be heading in that direction, given where American politics is today and probably heading, isn't it better for Israel to just say, unlike many of America's other allies, we don't accept American taxpayer money. We fight for American interests, but we don't need American taxpayer dollars to do it. Isn't that better for the United States, for Israel? And they will say yes, but. And the but is it's not just the money that's valuable, but with the money means we're invariably just cooperating on certain projects in the American security establishment, and we're in like the bowels of the Pentagon working with the U.S. That is as valuable as the money that pays for those projects, and they worry about that, and they also worry about the message it sends to Israel's enemies. That if the U.S. is cutting funding to Israel, does that look like symbolically the relationship is changing? That's a long-winded answer, but the gist of it is, I think if America continues on the trajectory that it's on, it is going to be more dependent on capable allies, and Israel is, a case study in what it means for America to have a valued, capable ally.
Dan, we've got a bunch of questions coming into the Q&A that all speak in different ways to the question of Israeli leadership. so much in history, so much in Jewish history turns on whether the leaders that we need emerge for the moment. And so I wonder if we could end with a little bit of reflection on what do you think the leadership of Israel will look like? Political leadership, religious leadership, civilizational leadership in 2048. And how do you think it will have been forged by this intense moment that we're living through now?
I'm less confident to speak about the future of Israeli religious leadership, but let me talk about political leadership. Um, I think what you've seen, Eric, over the last year and a half is the entire Israeli political spectrum move to the right. And what I mean by that is if you were a hard left, time for permanent peace with the Palestinians, quote unquote, permanent peace, some kind of two-state solution here and now, take tremendous risks at all costs. I think that that mindset in terms of how it's reflected on the Israeli political spectrum is gone. I mean, there may be small, but even when I interview on my podcast Israelis from the left all the time. I've interviewed, Israelis like political leaders from the left, Yair Lapid, Yair Golan, who's the head of the Democrats or the sort of modern day Labor or Mapai party. These, Golan is way on the left, and even he, like I had to, it was like pulling teeth from getting him to talk about the future of the Palestinians and a possible two-state solution. These guys are uncomfortable talking about it. They're uncomfortable talking about it because there's not only majority consensus support for that position, but even his own base is not entirely there. So I think and then if you were kind of center left or center, you've probably moved much harder right. So and these are on issues of security, Israeli security. I think for the first time in last couple of maybe since the second Intifada, that was a transformational moment where there was like a real consensus on Israeli security, and I think now is another transformational moment on with regard to the Israeli political consensus. So the question is, can you get an Israeli political right that is an alternative to the construct of the government we see today? That comes back to my earlier point about the fault lines in this coalition, which I think is again are going to begin to really break between the Haredim and the national religious parties. Could you get a right of center coalition that is very hawkish on these security matters, that see Israel's role in the region as not just dealing with the Palestinian issue? That's the other thing. I think many Israelis have only thought about their security situation prior to October 7th as just like this local Palestinian problem they had to solve. And I think now Israelis are kind of done thinking about the Israeli-Palestinian problem. Not that it's gone away, but they're tired of expending enormous political and diplomatic capital to try to deal with the Palestinian issue. They'll keep fighting the Palestinian issue. They'll keep fighting extremists in Gaza and the West Bank, but they also have to think broader in the region. And so about their taking an aggressive stance when necessary. So I think there's going to be a political consensus behind that. And I think you're going to see a right of center alternative to Likud emerge. And if that right of center, I think it'll be a new party. It'll be likely led, I think, by Naftali Bennett. And I think it could include, if you want to start talking about names, I think it'll likely include people ultimately like Avigdor Lieberman, like people like Yossi Cohen, the former head of the Mossad, maybe Yoav Gallant from Likud, although I'm less confident of that. These are just some of the characters you'll start seeing kind of breaking from the traditional right of center governments we've seen in Israel over the last number of years and forming a new right of center coalition that'll be an alternative. And I think it'll have most of the elements you see in the current right of center of government, absent the Haredi parties. And I think therefore they will also be able to bring in a number of left of center voters and political leaders who have moved to the right. And so I just think that the politics as we've known it in Israel for the last, number of decades it's like they're breaking before our eyes. I mean, it's happening right now. And I think you're going to what it means to be right of center in Israel is going to look different. It's going to have different personalities. It's going to have a different agenda. But at the core of the agenda will be, I think, a pretty hard-headed security agenda, which is where I think most Israelis are, not necessarily ideologically, but just practically.
Well, Dan, you've given us a hopeful vision of the future, where Israel's politically stronger, economically stronger, culturally vital, and captured how the creativity, technological ingenuity, the entrepreneurial spirit of the country is what is essential to building that future. It feels like there's a deeper undercurrent of all of this, a kind of Zionist moral clarity that gives Israeli families the will to raise children and the desire to build a future, that gives Israeli citizens the will to fight, often under tremendously difficult circumstances, and that gives Israel as a nation the confidence to stand up to those who seek its destruction, or question its moral, clarity. And this Zionist moral seriousness, this kind of Zionist sense of purpose, I think that's what we honor most and most deeply on Yom Ha'Atzmaut. And so thank you for, in your own Herzlian way here, painting a vision of what Israel could look like at 100, for engaging in this proud practice of Zionist imagining. And let us hope that this period of trial is also a period of great strength. So, Dan, for
Great.
all that you've done today and for all that you do to advance this conversation every day and every week, in the podcast and in so many other ways, we're all tremendously grateful.
Great. Thank you,
Uh,
guys. Thanks,
and
Eric.
with that, we will adjourn.